Welcome, everybody, and it's a really great pleasure today to introduce Governor Robert Holzmann of the Austrian National Bank to talk to us for half an hour about the outlook for the CEE region. Now, Mr. Holzmann has been the governor of the Austrian National Bank for 2 years. Before that, he had an extraordinary distinguished career in most of the main big international organizations of the world, including the OECD and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, as well as spending some time in Germany. So you're very well qualified to talk about this very important area of the world, Robert. First of all, I just want to ask you a brief question about the German elections, which we had now slightly more than a week ago. This is going to have a big impact on Europe as a whole. Are you relatively optimistic that we will get now a strengthening of European institutions in the wake of these very important elections in Germany?
Thank you much. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure being here. I'd love, of course, to answer questions about the election. Albeit, I to say, as a central banker, one feels not at ease and allowed to do so. But with regard to the German election, simply, it's the important country in Europe. So whatever the outcome it has a bearing. What I can say, there are two things. I think on the one hand, if you take the election, what we have seen is there have been a strengthening of the middle. So the extreme have been avoided, which is by itself nowadays a feast and a good result. The other one is that I have to say that overall a pro-European election has taken place, that those parties with the European focus have been elected. When it comes about the implications, well, we have to see what kind of coalition will come out, the Jamaica coalition or the traffic light coalition. I think there will be some differences between both coalitions, or would be some differences. But at the end of the day, whatever the outcome is, I don't expect, to say, a major overhaul in the European approach or the approach towards Europe coming out of the election by the Germans. I see more business as usual with some strengthening of the underlying topics, which have to do, as the FDP will be there, fiscal strengthening and fiscal conservatism, and of course the green agenda. But I don't think, how to say, there will be a new pro-European agenda, what a la Macron what is doing.
No, I think it could be quite a constructive melange between those two parties and one of the other major groupings. So I agree with you there, Robert. That's a good way of leading into the CEE, which are a region we've been talking about today. You are now squarely between the major countries of the EU and then what used to be called the hinterland. What do you make of the prospects for the CEE economies, both after the big financial crisis of 12, 13 years ago and the latest COVID upsets? They seem to be doing pretty well. What are the perspectives and how resilient do you think the economic recovery actually is?
As you mentioned, I think the countries did well, and they're doing well now, perhaps even better than we had expected. When the countries came out of the transition, they had the growth path, which was 1.5% above what we have in Euroland. What they have more recently were some kind of challenges. And what we see today is that in 2021, the recovery in the first half was better than expected. And also the recovery for the second half looks better, and also what it is in 2022, 2023. The current recovery is very much driven by, as in other countries, that the savings which we accumulated are spent now. They also profit from an export boom or for a demand for some of the inputs which are exported into Germany or beyond there. What the big question is and where they have to be more proactive has to do going beyond 22, 23 is to profit from a potential reshoring which may take place. So there are chances for a reshoring because two recent polls in Germany suggested that a non-important share of German industry wants to bring the suppliers closer home. And of course, this country would be nicely positioned to do so. but this won't happen automatically. And there's some restrictions which they need to overcome in order to make this happen.
So you think that these countries could actually be, if you like, a winner out of the standoff between the United States and China, because there has been generally a feeling that supply lines should be shortened. The question is, though, are they industrially and socially equipped to really match up to some big challenges that could come about as a result of such reshoring activity?
That's exactly the point. I think they're a nice position because they have, over the last 20 years, had a major inflow of foreign direct investment. At this time, they were largely focused on the car industry, where they became major producers of car and also of delivery for car parts to Germany. There are related other industries that have to develop. So reshoring other parts of industry they could do because they have now some of the infrastructure to make it happen. However, and perhaps we can talk about some of the details there, I think a big problem in these countries is at the political side, which has to do with the governance structure, making sure that the laws, making sure that what is in the package is also delivered by these countries. I think that's a great problem, which of course has heterogeneity across the countries, but I think this is a common topic. Another part, I think, which is quite important, has to do with the capacity to provide the skilled labor. Not that they don't have skilled labor, but they have this demographic bleeding out because much of this specialized labor went to Western Europe. And so what's remaining there is under huge pressure. So the supply constraint that we have, they are definitely there. And number three, of course, their financial markets are still relatively underdeveloped compared to what it would be useful for them if and as more foreign direct investment and related domestic investments come to the ground.
Well, all this applies to a very fundamental subject of our conference, of course, the strengthening of capital markets. And an issue connected with that, you mentioned that, Governor, is this question about governance. And everybody talks about ESG these days. They forget sometimes that the G in that does stand for governance. So it could well be that some of the investors who are putting money into the CEE are going to ask the issuers, the corporates and the governments to pay a bit more attention to this, because you can't just be caring about the environmental side. You've got to actually care about the nuts and bolts of corporate governance, haven't you? So I think your warning is quite well considered. Do you think that investors are going to be tightening the screws, if you like, in terms of the governance structures of the issuers?
The question always is whether the investors have a direct access to those countries and what are the signals to send out there. I think this is something where the rest of Europe also has to come to the fore in order to support those countries in their attempts to do it, which won't be easy because it has been attempted in some countries for 30 years. And success has been at times minimal. So this is something which outsiders can do, but at the end of the day, governance needs also live from own local developments. It cannot be imported.
Let's talk about central banks. You've now been the governor for 2 years. A big issue here has been getting the right balance between the fiscal side and the monetary side in Europe. We now have this next generation fund, which is an extraordinary new development. And we indeed still have pretty expansive fiscal policies in most countries in the European Union. Do you think that's going to take the strain off the central banks? So in the CEE, but in the euro area as a whole, it could well be that the central banks will have to do less now in terms of enhancing and maintaining the recovery, because fiscal policy will somehow take over the strain. Do you think that's the future?
Well, this is at least the master plan that what we all hope to. After I think monetary policy has been very supportive in the euro area, but also outside, even in these CEE countries, albeit to a low extent of the fighting the pandemic. And we all know the magnitudes that flew into Euroland via BEP program, via Deltro, and other programs. Now, how to say, it's time that these programs are get guarded while the fiscal policy takes over. Albeit on the fiscal policy, already a lot of money had been spent during transition. More money through this new generations funds will be spent. But I think overall, what Minister of Finance also see now, and it came up again recently in the Eurofin in Ljubljana, that also the programs have to be more selective nowadays. So after this huge expenditure spree which has existed, I think they know now that they have to come and be more selective in what they are financing and trying to keep a guard on their budget and on the debt level.
It seems to me also that this question of governance plays a role in the Next Generation Fund as well. The countries of the Central and Eastern Europe will be benefiting from this, and the taxpayers who are either funding or guaranteeing these instruments would like to know that the money is being well spent. It seems to me that the issue will be not so much getting hold of the money, but spending it in a wise way and monitoring it. Do you think there's going to be a role for the European institutions, and maybe also some private sector institutions, in actually acting as a monitoring agent, acting as a kind of scorecard keeper in Central and Eastern Europe to make sure that this money is spent wisely and well and produces a return?
No, I think you're straight on. This is the key question of all this additional money coming now from this new funder, is how to make sure that this money is well spent for the purposes it was intended to, and monitor the outcome so that the money is not only spent, but it has measurable results, which will be at the social level, but also the level of productivity growth. As we know, the European Commission has tried to do a lot in this direction, and the programs, how to say, have been partly quite complicated in order to make such a measurement happen. But this will be the key question, not only because to understand how the money is spent now, but also if the money is not well spent there, it will make it much more difficult in the future, if a future crisis were to come, to do a similar effort, because the political will to support it would be diminished.
That's right. And I would imagine there's lots of voters in Austria who have been sometimes somewhat skeptical about the EU spending too much money. They would want themselves to see some controls on this. Just one question about the future of Europe as a whole. This idea that we are now at a Hamiltonian moment because somehow Europe is gaining the resources to tax and spend itself, something that the European Commission didn't have before. Do you really think that is the case? Are we really at a moment when Europe is going to forge together a new future, almost like the birth of the United States of America? Or do you think that this is actually just a one-off fund for the purpose of getting over the worst of the pandemic? Which of those two do you think is the correct perspective, Robert?
I think it will depend on the way how this current money is spent, or at least this will have a major impact there. If and as this one-off fund doesn't deliver what is expected, I think it would be very difficult to convince the population, a number of countries, to go for a second go, or even make this a permanent fund as some expected. Making it work will be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. There are economic arguments why support of the less efficient countries is useful, because a currency union is a union of more or less productive countries. And if you come in with one exchange rate, the more productive profits, the less productive, how to say, suffer. And so to have some compensation to help them, to get them up to steam, is a part and parcel of the deal. But they're only spending the money without making sure that the money is spent wisely, and you move on a higher level convergence path. Or if this is not happening, then it creates major tension, as we have seen them across the world, or of similar institutional national constitutions that have been created, and this is dangerous.
Yeah, so it is a very important litmus test, I think, and you could use the English or the American expression, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, I think, here. I'd just like to move on now to the inflation outlook. There is clearly an idea going around that the inflationary spike, we've seen the prices in Germany now reach 4% for the first time now since the 1990s. There's some feeling that this may not be simply transient. You've been part of the discussions now around the table at the European Central Bank, playing a full part in this now for 2 years. We've had the extraordinary rise in the Czech National Bank interest rates, 0.75 percentage points, biggest rise since 1993, because clearly the Czechs are a bit worried about inflation. Do you think that's got implications for the rest of the CEE area and also for the EU as a whole? How will that feed into the various discussions you're having with your colleagues at the ECB, Robert?
At the moment, I would say we're all fascinated by our capacity to predict or not predict the future price level changes. And here definitely for the time being, we cling to the hope that the current inflation spike will be transitory. The question is, it will be transitory, but at what level will we come to rest? For a few months, we believe that it will come down again and below perhaps even the 2% target, which we have established this summer. Nowadays, we have to be a bit more careful because it becomes clear that the supply restrictions and the related increases in the prices of a number of an important inputs may remain for some time. Not that they yet create an inflation dynamics, but it may lead to an inflation level which situates above the 2%, perhaps well above the 2%. And then is the question, what will be the appropriate reaction of the central banks in order to keep it at this level, bring it down again to 2%. I think that's the key question. To answer now your question about what's the impact about on the CEE country, definitely if a country as well regarded as the Czech Republic increase the rate with such a level, this will also bring to the fore discussions in neighboring countries. In Poland, it already has also started, but if we follow the discussion in other countries, it will definitely have an impact. I don't think at the moment that it will have an impact on the ECB, but it will certainly show up in our discussions, and we will follow very closely what impact this interest rate increase will have on capital flows to and from the Czech Republic.
I don't want to prejudge what you and your colleagues will be discussing in the next few weeks. I know there's going to be some very difficult and quite challenging discussions, but would you not say that the ECB should in a way celebrate the fact that recoveries are taking place, that inflation is now inching up towards the 2% level if you take an average basis, and that this should actually be thought of as a good thing because it actually means the ECB policy is working to the extent that inflation is coming back into the system, which is what the central bankers wanted. Couldn't we see a bit more optimism about this?
You're perfectly right. There could be more celebration around it. The question is how much it has to do with our monetary policy that's still to be looked at, because for the time being, the inflationary shocks are coming from the outside, from the gaps in the supply channel. It's not how to say that we have seen it coming out from our own policy, but definitely our liquidity we put on the table helped to create some of these price changes, which otherwise would have taken place. It also helped to support the economic recovery, which seems to be much stronger than we had expected it. This applies for the euro area and also for Austria, where I think the next forecast for Austrian research institutes may be again 0.5% higher than the prior ones. But it also applies to the projections, what we have for Central Eastern Europe. They also got the most recent ones are higher than the prior ones. So I think overall, we are in good shape. Now we have to be very careful also to make the next steps at the margin, at the level, which also ensure that we are not going beyond too much, because as we know it from the 1970s, and since we are somewhat old and have gray hair, we still recall that. To say once you go into higher inflation dynamics, it's very difficult and very expensive with regard to GDP, as well as with regards to unemployment, to rectify an inflation dynamics if it gets out of hand.
That's right. Well, I've been doing a bit of research actually into the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, you did go through a phase when central banks, particularly in the United States, were underestimating the inflationary impact of things like the Vietnam War. But we won't go too much into the past. But I do take your point. One has to be careful about getting the right balance here. Now, a point about carbon pricing, which might actually hit the CEE more than other countries, is that there are going to be adjustments in relative prices. Your good friend and colleague Ignacio Visco was talking last week at a conference that ONFIF held on that. That's going to have a big impact, particularly on the CEE, one might say, as the carbon price level goes up. And he spoke very wisely about the need for distributional measures to make sure that those who were hit by, say, increases in energy prices, people living, say, in the countryside, were not going to be unfairly disadvantaged. How are governments and central banks going to get the right balance here in the CEE, would you say, when we talk about a more realistic carbon pricing in coming years?
Well, I think there are two issues. The first one is how carbon prices will be implemented, because for the time being, there's still a struggle between, on the one hand, to have for a carbon price tax straight on, and the other one is to use the financial market and the emission of certificates to make it happen. And for the time being, no discussion is taking place what is for the long term and for the short term the better instruments to guide it. And in the simple economic model, they're both equivalent, but in political reality and then the way it gets implemented has major differences. And there are some of the changes which we have recently seen in the carbon prices may be due to some of the expected price fluctuations which are coming in by more by the certificates, because the taxes by themselves have been rather the exception than the rule in much of Europe. So this is a kind of a precursor to your question. If and as then the carbon price changes through taxation, one form or the other, takes place, the question is how this additional burden is distributed. So the question is this a tax which can be used, tax revenues, in order to finance further investments in order to reduce carbon? Or is this something which should be given back to the population in what form? And I think this discussion has only started. We have all our favorites. I think there's a lot to say that the revenues should be distributed in a lump sum manner as a simple way, because this would help the poorest most. There are other people that have different suggestions for that. The third part is other kind of changes which take place. So if and as carbon prices, products rise because the production mode has changed. Here, the compensation should not take place, because this would alleviate the market signals to move towards a more carbon neutral economy. So this should not be compensated, but the one coming in through the taxation is a main instrument. Yes, this should be in principle all compensated for.
Yeah, well, thank you for that thoughtful reply, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that in coming years. All this that we've been talking about implies a lot of coordination these days between central banks and governments, and that's been very much a buzzword also for Christine Lagarde, also in her career before she came to the ECB. Is there a danger, do you think, that you can actually have too much coordination between central banks and the governments, which could be seen as them losing their fabled quotes independence, end quotes. Is there really an issue here about the two sides talking so much to each other that they're somehow in each other's pockets?
At the moment, I don't see this danger clearly, and this is part of the legal framework. The head of a central banker has to go to the political institutions, so Madame Lagarde has to go to specific committees of the European Commission, talk to parliamentarians, make this happen the way as Jay Powell passes in front of the American Congress. I think this is fair because we are independent. As a result of it, we have to defend ourselves. As I show up twice a year in front of the Austrian parliament and explain what we're doing. This is part of it. The other part is if and as one tries to over-program the fiscal policy into action. And I think here, yes, how to say, during a crisis, there may be more interaction than otherwise, because you have to make sure that you tell the other what you're doing, and if to explain it to them, like in an ethic relationship, if you don't coordinate, you have to have all the information available. The question is how to say whether this leads to really a kind of a joint back there. And I think here it's important that we go back to a situation in which the monetary policy takes care of the inflation rate. This is what we are there. This is our mandate there. And fiscal policy plays by the rule. And if I mention now Maastricht, of course, that's an anathema for some, but I think we have a rule, and this rule, how to say, needs to be looked at and seen how it gets implemented. And I hope the forthcoming reforms in this area go in this direction, that we have the separation, which has proven to be working, even as if everybody sticks to the rules they're set up.
The moment of truth, in a way, will come for the European Central Bank when interest rates do have to rise, which they haven't done, of course, for more than 10 years. We've had the harbinger now from the Czech Republic, who've been raising rates now for some years. Do you think that when the ECB does get around to raising rates, it'll do so at a time which will be convenient or helpful for countries which have got into a lot of debt? There is this issue about whether countries are getting into a debt trap, and where the ECB and other central banks simply won't be able to raise interest rates because it will make life too tough for the governments. Do you think we're going to get into that situation, or do you think you're going to be able to finesse that? Because that would really be a moment of truth for central bank independence if we ever did get into this issue of a conflict of interest.
Definitely, that's a key question for the next years to come, is how to make sure that on the one hand, you get the debt level under control, so that any rise in interest rate, how to say, becomes variable. But here the other part is important. Debt level become lower if and as expenditures do not explode. And the second part is if and as growth takes place, because we never pay back debt, we only grow out of growth. And so what we have to do is to make sure that productivity and everything which is there really takes place, then we can escape it. No productivity, no growing out of debt, and then we have the problems, as we know it from some countries in Europe that didn't have productivity growth for the last 30 years.
Well, that goes back really to some of these issues about the industrial culture, the social culture that we were discussing right at the beginning. Very final question to you, Robert. You've discussed the CEE economies. They've done pretty well, both after this latest crisis and the crisis we had 13 years ago. Do you think that this experience is going to increase or lower some of these countries' propensity to join the Economic and Monetary Union, which Austria is a member of? You can see this from several different vantage points, because you do have this historical and sociological link to Central and Eastern Europe. What do you think has made them more anxious or more happy to join the euro, this experience they've had in recent years?
My sense is that for whatever reason, countries choose a different approach in order to link up with the euro. So if you think about countries like Bulgaria, candidate of joining the euro, they fixed the exchange rate to the euro early on and ever stuck to that, and the macroeconomics is fine. You have Croatia wanting to do it. You have other countries saying, sorry, we feel much better, we feel much freer if we act alone, and you have Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary in this category. So I think there is an underlying national base for this decision, which for the time being I haven't seen being influenced by some of the things that happen. So I don't see now a major change that will take place. It's more to compare, to see. And what it shows is that both lives are possible, for some people staying out, for some countries staying out, and for some countries trying to join the euro. What is better, it's a question of ex-ante judgment, which I not make now yet.
No, well, I think that's a very good way of putting it. There's going to be a room, I think, for parallel lines and for some convergence, but it's going to be relatively heterogeneous. I think it's very important for the countries who are, say, in the EU but not in EMU, that they do have somebody like yourself, Robert, sitting at the council meetings, who, if you like, is somebody who can understand their predilections. So it's very helpful to have an Austro-Hungarian friend in court, shall we say, of some sort. And I think that's very helpful. I'd like to thank you very much for taking us through this whole list of different things affecting Central and Eastern Europe and the capital markets. It's been very, very helpful. And we look forward to getting together properly in person next time round, Robert. So let me thank you on behalf of all at OMFIV and all the people listening for this very fine dossier that you've given us. And I'm going to hand us over now to Chris Garnett, who's going to take us through the very final bits of the program. Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you everybody for listening.
My pleasure. Thank you.